No maid lasted more than 2 weeks. Some barely made it through the first night. The billionaire's son was paralyzed from the waist down, and every new maid walked in thinking they could handle the job until they saw what life inside that house was really like. Welcome to Stories Hub. Make sure you like and subscribe for your top-notch stories. Let us know in the comments section where you are watching from and what time you are currently watching this video. The house was a giant, sitting quietly on a hill just outside of Dallas, Texas. You could see the glass walls from the road like it was watching you before you even got close. Inside, everything was spotless, but the air was heavy, almost too quiet. The boy's name was Ethan. 14 years old, he had been in a car crash 2 years ago that left him unable to walk. His father, Richard Grant, was a billionaire oil tycoon with more money than he knew what to do with. But money didn't fix Ethan's attitude or his pain. On her first day, Julia, the new maid, stood in the hallway waiting for him to say something. She had been hired through a top agency, the kind that vetted every candidate with background checks and interviews. She wasn't afraid of hard work, she wasn't afraid of rich people either, but she had heard the rumors. Ethan was sitting in a wheelchair by the window, staring out at the wide lawn. He didn't even look at her when she walked in. "Hi," Julia said softly, tucking her hair behind her ear. "I'm Julia. I'll be helping out from now on." No response. She walked closer, careful not to make too much noise on the hardwood floor. "Is there anything you'd like for lunch?" Still nothing. He just stared. His hands gripped the wheels of his chair so hard his knuckles were white. That's when Julia noticed the mess on the floor. A tray had been knocked over soup, a sandwich, and a broken glass. She bent down to pick it up, but before she could, Ethan's voice cut through the room like a knife. "Don't touch it." Julia froze. His voice was sharp, almost angry, but there was something underneath it. Fear. "Okay," she said carefully, standing up again. "Oh," he finally turned his head toward her, his dark eyes almost too intense for a 14-year-old. "If you clean it up, he'll know." Julia didn't know what to say. "Who will know?" But Ethan didn't answer. He just turned back to the window. Later that day, Julia met Richard Grant for the first time. He was a tall man with greying hair and a sharp suit. He looked more like a CEO giving a board presentation than a father checking on his son. "How's Ethan?" he asked without really looking at her. "He's quiet," Julia said. Richard sighed, adjusting his cufflinks. "Quiet is good. Do your job. Keep him comfortable, don't ask too many questions, and we'll get along just fine." Julia nodded, but her stomach was in knots. Something about this place didn't feel right. That night, Julia heard something. A crash loud enough to make her jump out of bed. She grabbed the robe hanging on the chair and ran down the hall to Ethan's room. The lights were off. She flipped the switch and froze. Ethan's wheelchair was tipped over on its side and he was on the floor, his face pale and sweating. "Ethan." Julia dropped to her knees and reached for him. "What happened?" His eyes darted toward the door, wide with panic. "Don't let him in," he whispered. Julia felt her skin prickle. "Don't let who in?" Before Ethan could answer, heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway. Before we dive in deeply, let us know in the comments what country or which city you're watching this story from. We'd love to know how far this story travels. Julia's heart was hammering as the footsteps drew closer. She grabbed Ethan under his arms and tried to help him back into his wheelchair, but he was too heavy for her to lift on her own. "Julia," Ethan hissed, gripping her wrist. "Don't let him see me like this." The footsteps stopped right outside the door. Richard Grant's deep voice rumbled from the hallway. "What's going on in there?" Julia's mind raced. If she told the truth, Ethan would be humiliated or worse. Whatever he was so afraid of might happen. I dropped something," Julia called out, forcing her voice to sound calm. The door opened anyway. Richard stood there, his shadow filling the doorway. His eyes went straight to the tipped-over wheelchair and then to Ethan, lying helpless on the floor. "What happened?" Richard's tone was clipped, controlled, too controlled. "I was helping him," Julia said quickly, standing to block his view. "He slid off the chair. It's my fault." Richard's jaw tightened. "Get him back in the chair, now." Julia swallowed hard and nodded. With Richard's help, they got Ethan back into his seat, but the boy wouldn't look at his father, not once. Richard turned to Julia. "If you can't handle this job, I'll find someone who can." "I can handle it," Julia said firmly, though her hands were still shaking. When Richard finally left, Ethan exhaled like he'd been holding his breath the whole time. "Why didn't you tell him the truth?" Julia asked softly. Ethan didn't answer. He just turned his chair towards the window again. The next morning, Julia woke up to the sound of raised voices coming from Richard's office downstairs. She crept halfway down the staircase, stopping just out of sight. "I don't care what it costs," Richard was shouting. "Just find me someone who can keep him in line." Julia pressed her back against the wall, her stomach twisting. Was he talking about her or Ethan? The sound of the office door slamming made her flinch. She hurried back upstairs before Richard could see her eavesdropping. By the time she reached Ethan's room, he was awake and staring at the ceiling. "Do you want breakfast?" she asked quietly. He didn't look at her, just said, "You should quit while you can." Julia frowned. "Why would I quit?" "They all do," Ethan said. "Every maid before you. They all leave. Some of them don't even say goodbye." Julia sat down on the edge of his bed. "Why do they leave, Ethan?" His eyes finally met hers, and for a second, Julia saw something that looked a lot like fear. "Because it's not safe here." Before she could ask what he meant, a loud crash came from the kitchen downstairs, the sound of glass shattering. Julia jumped up and ran toward the stairs. By the time she got to the kitchen, Richard was there, standing in front of the counter with a furious expression. One of the cabinets was hanging open, and shards of broken plates were scattered across the floor. "Stay out of here," Richard snapped when he saw her. Julia froze. "I was just up. Go back upstairs." His tone was final, almost threatening. Julia backed away, her heart pounding. When she returned to Ethan's room, she found him gripping the armrest of his chair, his face pale. "He's angry again, isn't he?" Ethan asked quietly. Julia nodded. Ethan turned toward her, his voice almost a whisper. "Then we have to be careful tonight." Julia's stomach dropped. Careful of what? But Ethan just wheeled himself closer to the window and said nothing. That night, Julia lay awake listening for any sound. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Around midnight, she heard Ethan's wheelchair moving down the hallway. She got up and followed him. Ethan was rolling toward the back door, moving faster than she'd ever seen him go. "Ethan!" Julia whispered urgently. "Where are you going?" He didn't stop. Julia ran to catch up, her bare feet cold against the marble floor. By the time she reached the back door, Ethan had already unlocked it. The night air was cold, and the property stretched out into darkness. "Ethan, you can't go outside alone," Julia said, grabbing the back of his chair. He turned his head just enough for her to see the look in his eyes, desperate, terrified. "I have to," he said. "He's coming." Julia's blood ran cold. "Who's coming?" Ethan didn't answer. Instead, he pushed the wheels of his chair harder, heading straight into the dark yard. Julia hesitated for a split second, then ran after him. The grass was wet under Julia's feet as she chased after Ethan's wheelchair. The night was so still that every sound seemed louder: the squeak of the wheels, the crunch of her footsteps, even the distant hum of traffic far beyond the gates. "Ethan, stop!" Julia hissed, catching up and grabbing the handles of his chair. "Let me go!" Ethan shouted, his voice shaking with panic. Julia crouched beside him, trying to calm him down. "Ethan, it's the middle of the night. Tell me what's going on." For a moment, she thought he might actually tell her, but then a light flicked on inside the house behind them. Both of them froze. Richard was standing in the glass doorway, silhouetted by the warm glow from the hall. His voice carried across the lawn, deep and sharp. "What are you doing out here?" Julia's heart pounded as she tried to come up with an excuse. He wanted some air," she said, her voice trembling. "At midnight?" Richard's tone was ice cold. "It was my idea," Julia lied quickly. "I thought it might help him sleep." Richard stared at them for a long, heavy moment before finally stepping back inside. "Get him back in the house, now." Julia didn't need to be told twice. She wheeled Ethan back inside and locked the door behind them. When they were safely back in his room, Ethan was shaking. "You shouldn't have stopped me," he whispered. "Ethan, you scared me half to death," Julia snapped, her nerves frayed. "I thought something happened to you." "Something will happen to me," he cut in. "You don't get it." Julia sank onto the edge of his bed, rubbing her temples. "Then explain it to me, please." But Ethan just turned away, staring out the window again like he always did. The next morning, Julia woke up early, determined to get answers. She found Richard in his office, sipping coffee and reading something on his laptop. "Mr. Grant," she said carefully, "Ethan seems frightened. He tried to go outside last night. I think he's—" Richard shut the laptop with a snap. "I said, don't ask too many questions." Julia's breath caught. "With all due respect, sir, I'm responsible for your son's safety. If he's scared of something—" "He's a teenager," Richard interrupted. "They get scared. They act out. You're not here to psychoanalyze him. You're here to keep the house running. Do that." Julia bit her tongue and left before she said something that would get her fired. But all day she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, not just with Ethan, but with the entire house. The staff moved like they were on edge. No one spoke above a whisper. That evening, as she was clearing dishes from dinner, Julia heard Ethan call her name from the hallway. "Come with me," he said, wheeling himself toward the elevator that led to the basement. Julia frowned. "We're not supposed to go down there." "That's where he keeps everything," Ethan said. "You want answers? You'll find them there." Against her better judgment, Julia followed him. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, and they descended into the basement. When the doors opened, Julia's breath caught. The basement wasn't what she expected. Instead of dusty storage boxes, there was a long white hallway lined with locked doors, each with a keypad. "What is this place?" Julia whispered. "This is why no maid stays," Ethan said, wheeling forward. "Because they find out." "Find out what?" Before Ethan could answer, a loud beep echoed through the hallway, one of the keypads lighting up as if someone had just entered a code. Julia's pulse spiked. "Hide," Ethan hissed. She ducked behind one of the support beams just as the nearest door slid open with a low hiss. Footsteps. Slow, measured. And then Richard's voice, closer than she expected. "I told you not to leave your room at night, Ethan." Julia held her breath, her back pressed against the cold wall. She could see Richard's shadow stretching across the floor as he stepped fully into the basement hallway. Ethan didn't move. "I wanted her to see," he said. Richard's voice was colder now. "Then I guess she's seen enough." Julia's heart pounded so hard she thought he might hear it. Julia stayed completely still, her hands digging into the concrete as she crouched behind the support beam. Richard's shoes clicked against the floor as he walked closer to Ethan's wheelchair. "You disobeyed me," Richard said in a low, dangerous voice. Ethan didn't back down. "You can't keep hiding everything forever." Julia's pulse was racing. Hiding what? What was he talking about? Richard exhaled slowly, the sound sharp in the silence. "You're my son. My job is to protect you, whether you like it or not." "Protect me!" Ethan's voice cracked with anger. "You're the reason I'm like this." The words hung in the air like a gunshot. Richard didn't respond right away. His jaw tightened, and when he finally spoke, his voice was like steel. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I remember everything," Ethan said. Julia's stomach turned. Whatever was happening between them went deeper than she'd imagined. No. Suddenly, Richard's head turned slightly, just enough that Julia knew he'd heard something. "Come out," he said flatly. Julia's heart stopped. She hadn't made a sound. How did he know she was there? "I said come out," Richard repeated, his tone sharper now. Julia slowly stepped out from behind the beam, her legs trembling. Richard's expression barely changed, but his eyes were cold. "You should have stayed upstairs." Julia forced herself to stand tall. "I work here. If something is going on that puts Ethan in danger, I have a right to know." "You have no right," Richard said. "You're here because I allow it. That's all." Ethan's voice cut through the air, louder this time. "If you fire her, I'll tell everyone what you've done." Richard turned to him slowly, his face unreadable. "Careful, Ethan." Julia felt the tension crackling between them, and her instincts told her to get Ethan out of there now. "I think he needs rest," she said carefully, stepping towards the wheelchair. Richard didn't move. For a second, Julia thought he might stop her, but then he stepped back and gestured toward the elevator. Take him upstairs," he said. His tone was calm, but there was something in his eyes that made Julia's stomach twist. The ride back up was silent. Ethan's hands were gripping the armrest so tightly his knuckles were white. When they reached his room, Julia locked the door behind them. "Ethan," she said urgently, crouching in front of him. "What did you mean back there? What did he do?" Ethan's breathing was uneven. "He was driving the night of the crash," he said finally. "He was drunk. I told the police I didn't remember anything because he made me. He said if I told the truth, he'd—" He trailed off, his throat working like he couldn't get the words out. Julia felt a chill run down her spine. "Ethan, does anyone else know this?" "No," he said, "and if I tell anyone, he'll send me away, somewhere worse than this house." Julia was about to ask what he meant when a loud knock rattled the door. "Open up!" Richard's voice called from the hallway. Ethan's eyes went wide. Julia pressed a finger to her lips, signaling for him to stay quiet. The knock came again, harder this time. "Julia," Richard said, his voice low and even. "Open the door." She glanced at Ethan, who was shaking his head furiously. "Tss, I just put him to bed," Julia called back, trying to keep her voice steady. "He's exhausted." There was silence on the other side of the door for a long moment. Then Richard said, "We'll talk in the morning." Julia waited until his footsteps faded before she let out a shaky breath. Ethan wheeled himself closer to her. "He's not going to wait until morning," he said. Julia frowned. "What do you mean?" "He's going to do something tonight," Ethan said. "We need to be ready." Julia's heart pounded. She'd only been here 2 days, but she knew he was right. She couldn't just sit around and wait to see what Richard would do. So she came up with a plan. At midnight, Julia packed a small bag just enough for herself and Ethan. When the house went quiet, she helped him into the wheelchair and headed for the back door again. But this time, there was no silence. A security alarm beeped softly as soon as Julia opened the door, followed by a loud, mechanical click. The door wouldn't budge. And then, behind them, the lights in the hallway flicked on one by one. The lights clicked on in sequence. Boom, 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 until the entire hallway was flooded with white light. Julia's pulse spiked as she spun the wheelchair around. Richard was standing at the end of the hall, his hands clasped loosely behind his back. "You really thought you could just leave?" His voice was calm, almost eerily calm. Julia's throat went dry. "This isn't right, Mr. Grant. Ethan doesn't feel safe here. I'm taking him somewhere safe." Richard took a slow step forward. "You're not taking him anywhere." Ethan gripped Julia's wrist. "Don't let him get closer," he whispered. Julia tightened her hold on the wheelchair handles. "Then call someone. Call a doctor, a therapist, anyone. But we can't keep pretending this is normal." Richard's expression hardened. "You don't understand what's at stake." "Then make me understand," Julia shot back. For a long moment he just stared at them. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed a short, bitter sound. "You think this is about control, about pride? I'm the only thing standing between him and the world outside. You think the world cares about a broken, angry boy who can't even stand up?" "I don't care what the world thinks," Julia said fiercely. "He's your son, and right now he needs a father, not a warden." Richard's jaw clenched. Then Ethan spoke quietly, but with a strength Julia hadn't heard from him before. "Dad," he said, his voice steady. Richard blinked, clearly startled. "You can keep blaming me for what happened," Ethan continued, "but it doesn't change what you did. And it doesn't change the fact that I'm still here. I'm not going anywhere. Not tonight, not ever. I just need you to be my dad again." The silence that followed was so heavy Julia could hear her own breathing. Richard looked at Ethan for a long time, his face unreadable. And then something shifted. His shoulders sagged, and for the first time since Julia arrived, the sharpness in his expression softened. He walked forward slowly, kneeling in front of Ethan's chair. "I don't know how to be that anymore," Richard admitted, his voice low. "Then start now," Ethan said. Julia felt tears sting her eyes. For the first time since she'd met them, there was no anger between them, only raw honesty. Richard reached out, hesitated, then placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. And Ethan, the boy who hadn't smiled since Julia walked into this house, whispered one word that made Julia's chest tighten. "Mum." Julia froze, her heart catching in her throat. She looked down at him, stunned. Richard looked at her too, something unreadable in his eyes, but he didn't stop Ethan. Instead, he nodded slowly. "If she stays, it's because you want her to," Richard said. Ethan nodded once. Julia swallowed hard and put her hand over Ethan's. "Then I guess I'm not going anywhere." The house was still tense, but for the first time Julia didn't feel like running. She felt like staying. And for the first time in 2 years, Ethan let himself breathe. The end. Please like and subscribe for more rich stories like this. Comment below. Let us know in the comments section where you are watching from and what time you are currently watching this video. Also, if you really love this video and want to support the channel directly, you can hit that super thanks button below.